My name is Olivia Carter, and for most of my life, I lived in a quiet two-story house on Maple Ridge Street in Brighton, Colorado. It was the kind of place people described as peaceful from the outside. White paint, blue shutters, a wide porch, and a little maple tree that leaned toward the front yard, as if it were always listening to something. But inside, the walls carried a very different kind of sound, one I understood too well. Even as a child, I learned that every corner of that house held an expectation, a rule, or a reminder that my family's love had to be earned, not given. Still, I stayed. I stayed because it was the only home I knew, and for a long time, I believed that if I tried harder, they might see me. That belief broke on the morning of my brother Daniel's birthday. I woke early, hoping for a quiet hour to myself before the noise began. I liked the mornings, when the house was still half asleep and the sunlight crept in softly from the east-facing windows. I walked downstairs with slow steps, ready to make tea and maybe read on the small couch in the corner of the living room. But the moment I reached the bottom of the stairs, I froze. The entire ground floor was filled with decorations, silver balloons, gift bags, long boxes tied with thick blue ribbons. A tall stand held a brand new guitar, polished so clean that they would seem to glow. Next to it sat an envelope that probably contained money, because in my house, money was always Daniel's reward for existing. No one looked at me as I stepped into the room. My mother, Helen, rushed around with a tray of cupcakes, her blonde hair pinned up tightly as always. My father, Mark, was placing a stack of envelopes neatly on the dining table. Daniel, 2 years younger than me and always treated like royalty, sat on the sofa smiling as if this were all perfectly normal. And maybe it was. For them. I watched from the doorway, waiting for my mother to at least greet me, to acknowledge that I lived here too. When she finally looked up, her eyes didn't soften the way a mother's eyes should. They sharpened, as if she were annoyed that I had interrupted the perfect picture she had arranged. "Why are you just watching?" she snapped. "Go get your car keys and give your car to your brother as a gift." The words hit me so hard that for a second, I honestly thought I misheard her. My car wasn't fancy, but it was mine. I had bought it myself with money from the small online projects I worked on quietly at night. It was the first thing I ever owned that nobody could take credit for. I took a breath and forced myself to stay calm. "Mom," I said, "I'm not giving my car away." I expected her to sigh, maybe argue. Instead, her expression changed in an instant, twisting into anger so sharp it made her look like a stranger. My father turned toward me, his jaw tight, and even Daniel looked up with a flicker of surprise, though not enough to speak for me. "What did you say?" my father demanded, his voice rising louder than the music playing from the speakers. "Do not embarrass us today." I held my ground, though inside I could feel something trembling. "I said no," I repeated. "I'm not giving my car away." Then everything exploded. "You selfish lady," my father roared, pointing toward the door. "Get out of our house." The words echoed across the room, bouncing off the walls like they had been waiting years to be spoken. My mother didn't defend me. Daniel didn't defend me. No one blinked. It was as if they had all silently agreed that this was the day they were finally done pretending I mattered. For a moment, I felt nothing but shock. Then something inside me, quiet, tired, and long ignored, finally exhaled. All my life, I had begged silently for their approval. I had tried to be what they wanted. I had folded myself into shapes that hurt. But now, in this moment, something became painfully clear. There was nothing left to earn, nothing left to fight for. So, I did the one thing they never expected. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't plead or explain or ask why. I simply turned around, walked up the stairs, picked up my small leather bag, and came back down. I paused in the doorway for a final second, looking at the house that had never felt like home, the family who had never really felt like family, and the celebration that had never been for me. I didn't say a single word. I opened the front door, stepped onto the porch, and walked away. Behind me, I heard my mother mutter something like, "Finally," as if sending me out was a relief. I heard my father sigh, and I heard Daniel laughing again, as if losing a sister didn't matter. And maybe it didn't to them. But they didn't know what I knew. They didn't know that I had already built a life far beyond those walls. They didn't know that for years, while they ignored me, I worked silently and endlessly, using every free hour, every drop of energy, every ounce of determination I could find. They didn't know about the companies, the properties, the investments, or the long nights I had spent learning what they never believed I could understand. They had no idea that the daughter they just threw out owned a net worth of $180 million. Yes, $180 million. My empire. My work. My life. They thought I walked away with nothing, but in truth, I walked away with everything. I left with a future they would never have guessed belonged to me. And strangely, at that moment, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel hate. I felt free. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Because once I stepped off Maple Ridge Street that day, I knew I was stepping into the beginning of a story I would finally write for myself. When I stepped outside that morning, after my parents pushed me out of the house, the cold Colorado air wrapped around me like a truth I had ignored for too long. It was sharp on my skin, almost painful, but somehow it felt cleaner than anything I had felt inside that house. For the first time in years, I had no reason to look back. The porch behind me, the windows, the little maple tree leaning toward the yard, none of it belonged to the version of me I had become. I walked down the street slowly, not because I was sad, but because I was realizing something important. I was free. Truly free. And freedom had a strange taste, like shock mixed with relief, with a little sweetness underneath. Maybe the sweetness came from knowing a truth that my family did not. They believed I walked out with nothing. But they were wrong. They didn't know who I had become when they weren't looking. The truth was that no one in my family ever asked what I was doing with my life. They assumed I would follow simple paths, ones they could understand, ones they approved of. They believed Daniel was the child worth investing in, so they spent their time shaping him into some version of success they imagined. And me? I was the quiet one, the one who stayed out of the way, the one who didn't cause trouble. They mistook silence for weakness. They mistook distance for emptiness. They never understood that I learned to build my world alone, because they left no space for me in theirs. I started working at 18, long before anyone thought I had the ability to make something of myself. I took online courses at night while working small jobs during the day, cleaning offices in Portland, Maine, answering phones in Lincoln, Nebraska, even helping in a tiny bakery in a town near Cleveland. I took whatever I could, saving every dollar until my bank account grew enough to lift me out of the life they believed I belonged to. I never complained. I never asked for help. I never told a soul. Instead, I kept my dreams folded inside my chest like letters no one had the right to read. By 20, I had moved to Manchester in England, a city I chose because I needed distance, not just physical distance, but emotional distance from everything that made me small. Manchester wasn't glamorous, but it was real. It had people from all over Europe, and no one there cared about who my parents were or weren't. They didn't see me as the daughter. They saw me as a young woman trying to learn something. I studied business with a hunger I had never known. I learned about property, markets, negotiation, taxes, value, and patience. I learned how money moved, how people moved, and how I could move my life forward without asking permission. Europe gave me confidence I didn't know I possessed. When I returned to America, I was not the same girl who had left. I brought back something powerful, knowledge. And knowledge is something people underestimate until they see what it can turn into. I started buying small houses at first. A broken-down home in Lincoln. A tiny condo in Portland. A weathered townhouse in Ohio. I repaired them, sold them, saved the profit, and bought more. After 3 years of doing this quietly, I founded my own company, Carter Home Group. I used my own savings, every dollar I had painfully earned, and launched it without telling anyone in my family. Not because I wanted to hide anything, but because I knew they would never believe in me anyway. Carter Home Group grew faster than anyone expected. I studied American markets, then European trends. I bought a small villa in Vermont near a lake that glowed gold in the evenings. Then I bought an apartment in Dublin, Ireland, where I met people who trusted me more in one conversation than my own family had in 26 years. I expanded into Denver, into Boston, into the outskirts of London where old houses waited for someone who believed in second chances. Every contract, every deal, every risk was done under my name alone. I never shared power. I never surrendered ownership. And with every success, my silence became my strength. So when my parents told me to get out of our house, I could have laughed. Truly laughed. But I didn't. I simply walked away. Because the truth was simple, almost too simple. The house they had thrown me out of was mine. I had bought it 5 years earlier through one of my private companies, Fairline Estates LLC, because the market price at the time had been perfect. They had been renting it unknowingly, believing it belonged to an old friend of my father's. That old friend didn't exist. The owner was me. I paid for that roof, those windows, those floors, the same floors they told me to walk across and leave behind. They never bothered to ask who owned the house they lived in. They never asked why the property taxes were always paid early. They never asked why repairs were done before they even complained. They assumed the world moved around them, not realizing I had become the one quietly turning the gears. As I left the neighborhood that morning, I thought about all the years I had spent trying to be good enough for people who had already chosen who mattered and who didn't. It felt strange to finally admit to myself that I never really mattered to them. Not the way Daniel did, not the way they wanted their perfect family to look from the outside. But I mattered to myself now. And that was new. That was power. I walked down the street until the houses grew smaller and the noise of my old life faded behind me. I kept thinking about the irony of it all, their anger, their shouting, their accusations of me being selfish. They had no idea that I was the one who held everything they feared losing. And yet, I didn't feel the victory they might have expected. I didn't feel triumph or spite. What I felt was something deeper, a calm acceptance that they had never wanted to see me, that they refused to see the woman I had become. But now they would learn. They would learn who I was. They would learn what I built. They would learn whose house they had thrown me out of. And the world I walked toward, the one made of my work, my money, my name, opened its doors wide, welcoming me back like it had been waiting for me all along. 2 days after I walked out of my parents' house, I sat in my glass-walled office in downtown Baltimore, the sunlight cutting across the harbor and shimmering on the calm water. My office was on the 22nd floor, high enough that the city felt smaller, quieter, like a distant thought instead of a noise-filled place. People always told me the view was beautiful, but for me it was more than that. It was proof of who I had become. Every inch of that office belonged to me, built by decisions no one believed I was capable of making. And on that morning, as I waited for my lawyer, I felt something strange. Peace. Not happiness, not anger, just a kind of steady calm that came from knowing I was done asking for space in a family that never gave me any. The door opened softly, and my lawyer, Evan Parker, stepped inside. Evan was a man in his early 40s with calm eyes and a way of speaking that made everything sound reasonable. He carried a dark folder in his hand, and when he set it on my desk, he did so with a gentle seriousness, almost like he was placing down something delicate. "It's ready," he said. I opened the folder. Inside was the legal notice that would give my parents 30 days to vacate the house, my house, the same house they had thrown me out of, without hesitation. The document was clear, firm, and unbreakable. It wasn't written in anger, it was written in truth. They had no legal right to the property. They never had. They only had the illusion of ownership, an illusion I had allowed to exist because I wanted to avoid hurting them. But illusions only survive as long as someone chooses not to see reality. And I had finally outgrown pretending. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Evan asked quietly. I didn't let myself hesitate. "Yes," I said. "Send it." My voice didn't shake. I didn't look away. I didn't feel guilt sink into my stomach the way it used to whenever my parents' names came up. The moment the words left my mouth, I felt the kind of finality that comes when a door closes, not with anger, but with acceptance. Evan nodded, slid the folder back toward himself, and stood. "They will receive it by tonight," he said. I watched him leave my office, and when the door clicked shut, I leaned back in my chair and let myself breathe. Not a shaky breath, not a painful breath, just a real one. A breath that came from a place of strength. That evening, I returned to my penthouse across the harbor. The space was open and warm, decorated with soft browns and pale golds I had chosen myself. I liked quiet places, places where the world couldn't find me unless I allowed it. I made myself a cup of tea, sat on the balcony overlooking the city lights, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like my life belonged to me again. At 7:30, my phone rang. I looked at the screen. Mom calling. I didn't answer. 5 minutes later, my father called. Then Daniel. Then my mother again. And again. And again. I let every call ring until it stopped. My phone vibrated on the table like a nervous heartbeat, but I didn't pick it up. I didn't know them my voice. Not after everything they had screamed at me. Not after they pushed me out like I was a burden to be removed. Around 11:30, the calls turned into messages. Olivia, please call us. We need to talk. Why didn't you tell us? Come home. We didn't know. Please call us. This is serious. I set the phone face down. The messages felt loud even in silence. They were not apologizing for what they said to me. They were not sorry for the years of ignoring me, belittling me, treating me like the extra piece in a family puzzle. They were panicking because of the house, because of the roof over their heads, because now they understood that the power they always thought they had over me was nothing but a shadow the whole time. At midnight, the screen lit up again, this time with a message from Evan. They received the notice. I stared at those 4 words. They felt like the final click of a lock. Something inside me settled. Not happiness. Not revenge. Something simpler. Release. My phone buzzed again, a long list of new messages from my parents. My mother wrote that they were confused, that they didn't understand why the notice had my company's name on it. My father demanded I explain myself. Daniel asked if this was some kind of misunderstanding. None of them said, "We're sorry for how we treated you." None of them said, "We were wrong." None of them said, "We hurt you." They were afraid of losing the house, not afraid of losing me. And that truth no longer broke me the way it once would have. I picked up my tea again, letting the steam warm my face, and leaned back in my chair. In the quiet, I thought about how strange it was that they had lived under my roof all these years, telling me I wasn't enough, pretending they held power over me when the walls around them existed because of my work. They had thrown me out of a house I bought. They had claimed ownership over something that was never theirs. Now they finally knew. The rest of the night passed slowly. I watched the city lights dance along the water, listened to the distant hum of cars on the bridge, and let myself feel something I had long forgotten. Pride. Not arrogance, not superiority. Pride in myself. Pride in my silence, in my strength, in the life I built far away from the voices that tried to break me. Around 2 in the morning, when the city had grown quiet and my phone had finally stopped buzzing, I whispered into the empty room, not with anger, but with certainty. They made their choice. Now I'm making mine. The notice had been sent. The truth had been revealed. And for the first time in my life, they needed me more than I needed them. But I wasn't ready to answer them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. This was the beginning of my voice. Finally loud enough, finally strong enough, finally mine. The morning after the notice was sent, and the flood of calls filled my phone, I woke up before sunrise. The city was still dark, the streets quiet, and a faint silver glow stretched across the sky over Baltimore Harbor. I stood at the window of my penthouse, watching the world slowly brighten, and for a moment, I felt both older and lighter. Something inside me had shifted permanently, like a door I had locked from the inside. I wasn't the same Olivia who had walked out of my parents' house. That Olivia had been wounded, confused, still hoping for understanding. But this Olivia, the one standing here at dawn, was someone new, someone who had finally found the center of her own strength. I needed a breath of fresh air. Not the city air, not the noise of people rushing to work, but something real. Something that felt like a clean page. So I packed a small bag, took my keys, and slipped into the elevator with a calmness that surprised me. As soon as I stepped outside, I felt the cool morning breeze touch my face. I unlocked my car, sat inside, and began driving north. No music, no calls, no noise except the hum of the engine and my own thoughts. 3 hours later, I crossed into Vermont. The roads here were lined with tall trees, some still carrying their autumn colors, deep reds, burnt oranges, golden yellows. The sky had turned soft and blue, and each mile felt like it was peeling away another layer of stress I had carried for years. When I reached Burlington, I drove down a quiet street near the lake until I stopped in front of one of my favorite places in the world, Grace's Hearth Cafe. Grace Miller, the owner, had been running it for nearly 20 years. She was a warm woman in her late 50s with smiling eyes and a gentle voice, the kind of person who remembered not just your name, but your favorite drink, your mood on a rainy day, and even the dreams you mentioned once in passing. When I pushed the door open, the bell above it chimed softly. The smell of fresh coffee, cinnamon, and baked bread wrapped around me like a blanket. "Olivia," Grace said, her face lighting up with a kind of kindness you can't buy or fake. "You're early today." I smiled back. "Needed a quiet morning. You always have a place here." She gestured to the window seat, my seat, the one she saved for me even when the cafe was full. I slid into the chair, feeling the wooden surface familiar under my hands. Through the window, I could see the lake shimmering in the soft sunlight. Grace placed a mug of warm coffee in front of me, and as I wrapped my hand around it, I felt something inside me settle in a way it hadn't done in years. The peace of the cafe made my mind drift back over the last few days, and then even further back, to the years spent living in a house where my voice never mattered. I remembered standing quietly in the corners of rooms, watching my parents speak proudly of Daniel while I stood like a background character in my own home. I remembered being told to be grateful, to not make things difficult, to understand that Daniel needed more. I remembered birthdays where my name was barely spoken, achievements that were ignored, small successes treated like accidents instead of effort. But I also remembered the day I finally walked away. And now, sitting here with warm sunlight touching my face, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to fully acknowledge. I didn't lose a family that day. I lost people who never saw my worth. And losing people who don't value you isn't a tragedy. It's freedom. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth travel through me. For years, I had forced myself to believe that family meant loyalty no matter the cost. But what is loyalty without respect? What is family without love? I had given everything, my time, my patience, my silence, and received nothing but judgment in return. But now I had something stronger than their approval. I had my independence. I had my empire. I had my voice. My phone sat on the table, face down. I already knew it was filled with missed calls and messages. My parents had probably tried calling again this morning. Maybe Daniel too. I didn't check. I wasn't ready to hear their panic, their fear, their sudden desperation. They wanted access to the life they thought I didn't have. They wanted the house they believed belonged to them. But none of them wanted me. They wanted what I had built. Grace sat across from me for a moment, wiping her hands on a towel. "You look like you're carrying something heavy," she said softly. I met her eyes. "Not anymore," I replied. "I think I finally put it down." She gave a knowing smile before getting up and returning to the counter, leaving me alone with my thoughts again. America is big. Europe is wide. And life is full of roads waiting for someone brave enough to walk them. For years, I walked the hardest ones alone. I moved through doubts, through nights of exhaustion, through the quiet ache of being unseen. And yet, each step built me. Each struggle sharpened me. Each lonely moment pushed me toward a future I created with my own hands. I looked out the window again, watching people stroll near the lake, couples holding hands, an older man walking his dog, children laughing as they ran across the grass. Life was moving relentlessly forward, and I was finally moving with it, not stuck behind the emotional walls of a house that never felt like home. My parents still called, every day. They wanted answers. They wanted forgiveness. They wanted the comfort of knowing the roof above their heads would remain theirs. But forgiveness isn't something you force. It isn't a door you unlock just because someone knocks loudly. Maybe one day I would forgive them, not for their sake, but for my own peace. But I would never forget the day they told me to get out. The day they threw me out without hesitation. The day they made it clear that my place in their lives was conditional. They pushed me out of a house. But in doing so, they pushed me into a world they never believed I could reach. I rose. I built. I created an empire with my name etched into every contract, every deed, every success. My empire stands.
My voice stands.
And for the first time in my life, I stand too, without fear, without shame, without needing anyone to tell me I am enough. I finished my coffee, stood from the table, and walked out of the cafe into the bright Vermont morning. The sun felt warm on my face, the breeze soft against my hair. And as I stepped onto the quiet street, I whispered something to myself, not a promise, but a truth I had earned. I stand for myself now. And nothing, not the past, not their apologies, not their fears, could take that away from me.